What would you do if your new neighbor walked into your life like she owned it? Jake had always been the kind of guy people respected but rarely noticed. He kept his lawn neatly trimmed, waved politely to his neighbors, and even helped the elderly couple next door carry their groceries inside when needed. Life in his quiet suburban neighborhood had been peaceful for years, until she arrived. Karen moved in on a breezy Saturday afternoon, and within minutes, Jake knew something was off. She wasn't like the other new arrivals who smiled shyly and eased their way into the community. No, Karen announced herself. While her movers struggled with her oversized furniture, she took it upon herself to introduce herself, not as a neighbor, but as an authority. I used to be on my old neighborhood's council, she said, beaming like she'd just admitted to running the country. It's so important to keep things in order. I just love making sure everyone does their part in a community. Jake offered a polite nod, assuming she was just trying to make conversation. He even helped her lift a heavy dresser into her living room. She thanked him with a tight-lipped smile and a nod, but something about her demeanor didn't sit right with him. It was like she was evaluating him, not appreciating his help. Then the request started. First, she asked to borrow a power drill, no big deal. Then, she needed him to water her plants while she went away for the weekend. A little annoying, but fine. Then, her internet wasn't set up yet, and she needed to use his Wi-Fi for a few days. Not once did she say thank you. It wasn't even a request, it was an expectation. And then came the moment he knew she was trouble. One Friday afternoon, Jake was unloading groceries from his Chevy Tahoe, the vehicle he had worked hard to afford and maintain. It wasn't just a car, it was his pride and joy, perfect for weekend camping trips and hauling gear. He had just closed the trunk when he heard that voice. "Hey, Jake." He turned to see Karen striding across the street, her smile too wide, her eyes locked on his SUV. "I need to borrow your Tahoe this weekend," she said, as if she were discussing the weather. Jake blinked. "What?" Jake let out a short, disbelieving laugh, waiting for Karen to add a "just kidding" or "I know that's a big ask," but she just stood there expectantly, arms crossed like she had already made up her mind for him. "Sorry, but I don't lend out my car," he said, keeping his voice calm. Karen's smile faltered. "Oh, come on, Jake, it's just a car. My sister is moving this weekend, and your Tahoe is perfect for hauling furniture. I'll just grab the keys, and I'll have it back by Sunday night." Jake shook his head. "That's not happening." Karen let out an exaggerated laugh, the kind that wasn't meant to be funny but was meant to make him feel like he was being unreasonable. "Seriously? It's not like you're using it all weekend. What's the point of having a big car if you're just going to let it sit there?" Jake stared at her. Was she actually serious? "The point is, it's my car, and I don't owe it to anyone." For a second, Karen just stood there, lips pressing into a thin line. Then, with an exasperated sigh, she flipped the switch, the smile dropped, the arms crossed tighter, and the irritation settled in her features like he had personally offended her. "Fine," she snapped. "I just thought you were a decent neighbor who actually helps people." She stormed back across the street, slamming her front door behind her. Jake exhaled, shaking his head, hoping that was the end of it. But deep down, he knew better. The next morning, he woke to the sound of someone pounding on his front door. Still groggy, he grabbed his coffee before answering. Karen stood on his porch, her expression twisted with frustration. "You are unbelievable," she hissed. Jake pinched the bridge of his nose. "Karen, what now?" She threw up her hands. "I told my sister I'd have a truck for her this weekend. Now I look like a liar." Jake took a slow sip of coffee. "Sounds like a you problem." Her eyes flashed. "I thought maybe you'd come to your senses overnight." "Nope. Still no." She let out a loud, theatrical groan, throwing her hands up like she was talking to a toddler. Unbelievable. You'd rather let your car sit in your driveway than actually help someone? Jake shrugged. I use it when I need it. Karen inhaled deeply, composing herself, then tilted her head with a sly smirk. Alright, how about this? Sell it to me. Jake nearly choked on his coffee. Excuse me? You heard me. Name your price. I'll buy it. Jake let out a short, humorless laugh. Karen, my car is not for sale. Her expression darkened. Oh, come on. Everything has a price. Not my car. For a long moment, she just stared at him, nostrils flaring like she couldn't believe she wasn't getting her way. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her house. Jake exhaled, exhausted, hoping that was truly the end of it. But later that evening, when he came home from work, a note was stuck to his windshield. At first, he thought it was a flyer until he pulled it off and read the handwritten message. People like you ruin neighborhoods. Maybe think about what kind of neighbor you want to be before making enemies. Jake stared at the note in disbelief. Was she actually trying to intimidate him over a car? He tore it in half and tossed it in the trash. He was done entertaining her nonsense. But in the back of his mind, a bad feeling crept in. The next morning, things got worse. Jake stepped outside with his morning coffee, but his eyes immediately narrowed. Karen was standing in his driveway. Not near it. In it. She wasn't even pretending to be polite anymore. Arms crossed tightly, her face twisted with frustration, she planted herself directly in front of his Tahoe, blocking his way. Jake sighed. He really didn't want to start his day like this. You're seriously still refusing to be a decent neighbor, she snapped. Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, willing himself to stay calm. Karen, I don't know how else to say this. My car is mine. I'm not lending it out. End of discussion. She let out a harsh laugh, shaking her head like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. You know, she said, her voice dripping with venom, I've been talking to the other neighbors. They all agree that you're being completely unreasonable. You're supposed to help people in a community. Jake raised an eyebrow. You've been complaining about me to the neighborhood? Karen smirked. Yes. And guess what? Nobody thinks you're in the right. Jake shrugged. Good for them. Still not changing my mind. Her jaw clenched, and she took a step closer, lowering her voice. I know you don't use your car every day, she said, eyes flicking toward the driveway. I see it just sitting here for hours. It's a waste. Jake's patience was wearing thin. Are you seriously keeping track of when I use my own vehicle? Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. I live across the street. It's hard not to notice when it never moves. Jake took a deep breath, doing everything in his power to keep calm. Karen, I don't owe you anything. I don't care what you think is a waste. The car is mine. The end. She tilted her head, a slow smirk forming. You know, she said casually, I was talking to my brother-in-law. He works in city planning. He says it's technically against zoning laws to keep an unused vehicle parked in a driveway for too long. Jake narrowed his eyes. That's nonsense. Is it? She asked, shrugging. I could always report it. You might end up with some hefty fines. Jake let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Karen, I don't live in an HOA. And even if I did, my SUV isn't unused. I drive it when I need to. Her smirk faltered, but she recovered quickly. That's not the point, she said smoothly. The point is, you're being difficult for no reason. Jake folded his arms. No, Karen. I'm refusing to be bullied. She let out a dramatic sigh, as if she were dealing with a child. I just don't understand why you're so against helping someone, she whined. I would do the same for you. Jake let out a dry chuckle. You wouldn't even let me borrow a ladder last week, Karen. Her face flushed red. That was different. Jake raised an eyebrow. How? Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she had no response. Finally, she huffed. Fine. You want to be that guy? Go ahead. But don't be surprised if people stop being friendly with you. Jake shrugged. I'll live with that. Karen stomped back to her house, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. Jake exhaled, shaking his head. He knew she wasn't going to let this go. But he wasn't prepared for what she did next. Jake had barely processed Karen's last tantrum when things escalated in a way he never expected. That night, as he settled into bed, something gnawed at the back of his mind, a creeping unease that wouldn't go away. He had locked his car, right? He was always careful about it. But the next morning, when he stepped outside with his coffee, his stomach dropped. His Tahoe had moved. Not a lot, just a few feet forward. But enough for him to know he hadn't parked it like that. His driveway had fresh tire tracks that hadn't been there the night before. His hands clenched into fists as he strode over, his pulse hammering in his ears. The driver's side door was unlocked. Jake's breath came out sharp and slow. No. No way. There was only one person who would have the audacity. With a deep inhale, he pulled out his phone and checked his security footage. As he scrolled through the recording, his gut twisted in pure rage. There she was. At 5:30 p.m., just after sunset, Karen crept across the street. She glanced around, making sure no one was watching. Then, she tried the driver's side door. It was locked. Jake nearly relaxed. But then, 2 minutes later, she returned. This time, she had a key. Jake's entire body stiffened. A key? How in the hell did she have a key? The footage showed Karen unlocking the door, sliding into the driver's seat and starting the engine. She didn't steal the car. She just moved it slightly forward before stepping out and walking back to her house like nothing had happened. Jake had seen enough. His hands were steady as he dialed 911. When the dispatcher picked up, he explained the situation as calmly as he could, but the anger bled into his voice. Within 15 minutes, a patrol car pulled up in front of his house. 2 officers stepped out, one heading toward Karen's house, the other approaching Jake. What happened here? The officer asked. Jake held up his phone. I have security footage of my neighbor trespassing on my property, unlocking my SUV, and moving it without my permission. The officer's expression hardened. Let's take a look. Jake played the footage, and both officers watched in silence. After a moment, one of them nodded. That's definitely unauthorized entry. They turned toward Karen's house. Jake watched as one officer knocked on her door. A moment later, Karen appeared, feigning surprise. Oh, officers. Is there a problem? She chirped, her voice too sweet to be real. Yes, ma'am, one of them said, his tone flat. Your neighbor has security footage showing you entering his vehicle without permission. Do you want to explain what happened? Karen's face paled. For just a second, she panicked. But then, she recovered fast. Oh. That was just a misunderstanding, she stammered. I was just checking something for him. The officer raised an eyebrow. Checking what? Karen swallowed hard. He told me I could use it. I thought I had permission. Jake stepped forward. His voice was sharp. I absolutely did not give her permission. The officers exchanged a look. One of them sighed. Ma'am, this is trespassing. You cannot enter someone's vehicle without consent. Karen's fake confidence wavered. This is ridiculous. I didn't steal it, I just moved it a little. That doesn't matter, the officer said firmly. If the owner didn't authorize you, it's a crime. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Her gaze flicked between Jake and the officers, searching for an escape. For the first time, she had no control. You're not actually going to arrest me, are you? She blurted, her voice tinged with panic. The officers stood firm. For now, we're filing an official report. If your neighbor chooses to press charges, this could escalate into a legal case. Silence stretched between them. Karen's face twisted in pure hatred. Jake met her glare with a steady stare. He had a choice, press charges now or let her off with a warning. For a long moment, he considered it. But Karen wasn't just an annoying neighbor, she was dangerous. If she was bold enough to break into his car once, she'd do it again. I'll think about it, he finally said, his voice even. The officers took down Karen's information and turned back to Jake. We strongly suggest changing your car's locks, one of them advised. If she somehow got access to a key, it's best to make sure she can't use it again. Jake nodded. I will. Karen glared at him one last time before slamming her door shut. Jake let out a slow breath. This wasn't over. And he was right. The next morning, he woke up feeling angry but relieved, at least the police had put her in her place. Or so he thought. When he stepped outside to check on his Tahoe, something bright and obnoxious was stuck to his windshield. A giant orange sticker. Jake's stomach dropped. He stepped closer. It was a violation notice. A piece of paper was taped beneath it, bold letters scrawled across the top. Your vehicle has been reported as abandoned. Per city regulations, it must be moved or it will be towed. Jake's hands clenched into fists. Karen. His head snapped up, scanning the street. And sure enough, there she was. Standing on her porch. Arms crossed. Smirking. Jake marched up to her driveway, the violation notice clenched in his fist. You think this is funny? He snapped. Karen tilted her head, all fake innocence. I don't know what you mean, Jake. His grip tightened around the paper. You called the city and reported my car as abandoned. She shrugged. It's been sitting in the same spot for days. That's against regulations, isn't it? Jake let out a sharp, humorless laugh. You're really that petty, huh? Karen smiled. Maybe if you were more cooperative, this wouldn't be happening. Jake inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. Fine. She wanted to play dirty? Game on. Jake had dealt with his fair share of difficult people, but Karen was something else entirely. She wasn't just annoying, she was vindictive, manipulative, and completely unhinged. Reporting his car as abandoned just to get under his skin? That wasn't just petty. It was personal. But instead of losing his temper, Jake got smart. He took out his phone and snapped clear photos of the false violation notice, then immediately dialed the city's code enforcement office. A bored-sounding officer picked up, but as soon as Jake explained what had happened, the man's tone sharpened. Sir, if your vehicle is legally registered and parked on your own property, that report is invalid. Jake smirked, already seeing an opening. And what happens to the person who filed a false complaint? The officer let out a sigh. If we receive multiple false reports from the same individual, they can be fined heavily for wasting city resources. Jake liked the sound of that. Good to know, because I have a neighbor who just did exactly that. I also have security footage of her taking photos of my car at night. Would you like that as well? There was a pause. Then, the officer's voice turned businesslike. Send over everything. We take false reports seriously. Jake didn't waste time. Within minutes, he had forwarded all the evidence, including a clip of Karen sneaking around his driveway, snapping pictures of his Tahoe. Then, he sat back and waited. And it didn't take long. A few hours later, a city enforcement officer showed up at Karen's house. Jake stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Karen answered the door with her usual plastic smile, but when she saw the officer, that smile vanished. "Ma'am," the officer began, holding up a clipboard. "We've received evidence that you knowingly filed a false complaint against your neighbor's legally parked vehicle." Karen's face paled. What? "No. I was just reporting a violation." The officer didn't even blink. "Your report was unfounded, and your behavior constitutes misuse of city resources. As a result, you are being issued a fine." Jake couldn't help but grin when he saw Karen's hand visibly tremble as she accepted the violation notice. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising. "I was just trying to help clean up the neighborhood." The officer remained unfazed. "If this behavior continues, further action will be taken." Karen stood there, gripping the paper so tightly her knuckles turned white. For once, she had nothing to say. She stormed inside, slamming her door shut. Jake chuckled. Round 1, Jake. For a few days, everything was eerily quiet. Karen didn't speak to him, didn't look his way. Even the usual passive-aggressive notes stopped appearing. And then, just when he thought she might finally be backing off, she did something that made his blood boil. Late one night, long after Jake had gone to bed, a loud bang shattered the silence. His eyes snapped open, heart pounding. The sound had come from outside. Adrenaline surging, he grabbed his phone and rushed to the window. His stomach dropped. His Tahoe's windshield was completely shattered. The side mirror hung limply, half snapped off. Glass shards glistened under the streetlights. And in the shadows, standing just beyond the broken glass, holding a bat in her hand, was Karen. For a moment, Jake couldn't move. The sheer audacity, the level of unhinged vengeance she had just crossed into, it was beyond anything he had expected. Then, rage took over. He grabbed his phone, hit record, and called 911. 911, what's your emergency? My neighbor just smashed my car with a bat. I have her on camera. Get someone here now. The dispatcher barely had to ask for details before sirens lit up the street. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Jake stormed outside, pointing straight at Karen. There she is, he said. She did it. I have video proof. Karen, standing in her yard like nothing had happened, tried to play dumb. What? I was just... One of the officers raised a hand. Ma'am, we need you to step over here. She hesitated, bat still in her hand. You're not actually going to arrest me, are you? She scoffed. The officer's face was unreadable. We're going to need to see that footage first. Jake didn't hesitate. He played the crystal-clear recording of Karen sneaking up to his SUV, raising the bat, and smashing the windshield. There was no denying it. The officers turned back to Karen. Ma'am, you're under arrest for destruction of property. Her jaw dropped. What? No. You can't do this. This is insane. One of the officers grabbed her arm, pulling out the handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. This is harassment, she screeched. Jake crossed his arms, watching in satisfaction as they cuffed her and led her toward the patrol car. As they put her inside, she locked eyes with him. Her gaze was full of pure, unfiltered hatred. Jake just smiled. And this time, there was no doubt in his mind. Karen was done. By morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with whispers about Karen's spectacular downfall. Word spread fast, the entitled woman who had terrorized the street for weeks was finally in handcuffs. People peeked through their blinds, muttering among themselves, exchanging glances of shock, amusement, and even relief. Some who had once sided with her now suddenly fell silent, pretending they had never been part of her schemes. Jake, however, wasn't celebrating just yet. There was one final twist. That afternoon, as he sat on his porch enjoying his coffee, a black SUV pulled into Karen's driveway. A man in his late 40s stepped out, well-dressed, sharp-eyed, and looking downright exhausted. Jake didn't have to guess. This was Karen's estranged husband, Brian. Brian marched up to her front door and knocked hard. When no one answered, he sighed and pulled out his phone. Seconds later, Karen's door cracked open just enough for her to peek out. Jake could hear their hushed, angry exchange from across the street. "Are you serious, Karen? I got a call from the police. You got yourself arrested, again?" "This isn't my fault," she hissed. "It never is it?" Brian shot back. "This is exactly why I left. You pull the same stunt everywhere you go. You think people owe you something. But now, even the law isn't on your side." A long silence stretched between them before Brian shook his head. "You're selling the house. I don't care what you think. It's over, Karen." Jake didn't even try to hide his smirk. By the end of the week, a "for sale" sign appeared in Karen's front yard. A month later, she was gone. Just like that, the neighborhood went back to normal. No more entitled demands, no more fake complaints, no more threats. Jake's Tahoe was repaired, but the real victory was peace. No more walking outside and wondering what ridiculous stunt Karen would pull next. No more dealing with backhanded comments or smug smirks. Just silence. Blissful, uninterrupted silence. He took a deep breath one morning as he sat on his porch, watching the last of Karen's moving boxes disappear into a truck. And then, as if sensing him watching, she turned one last time. For a split second, their eyes met. There was no anger left in her face. Just defeat. Jake lifted his coffee mug in a silent toast. Karen scowled, turned away, and climbed into the moving truck. And just like that, she was gone. But the damage she had caused, the chaos she had spread, it all left a mark. The real question is, what do you do when a Karen like this moves into your neighborhood? Have you ever dealt with someone this entitled? Let's hear your worst HOA or Karen nightmare stories below.